Now, the last thing that I wanted to talk about on this podcast was politics, but there were a few more developments in the story that I talked about last week, and of course that was it was Donald Trump and the Capitol Hill riots. And the first big development immediately after that was that Twitter turned around and they banned Donald Trump from the service. So the first development after that was Twitter turned around and they banned Donald Trump from their service. Once they did that, a number of other prominent social media services also followed suit and also either banned or heavily restricted Trump. I mean, in particular, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram. They all placed new restrictions on Donald Trump. Now, there were a lot of people out there who were very unhappy to see that. And frankly, from my own perspective, I mean, I'm not happy that it happened either. But I do understand why they did it, and in all honesty, I think that in a lot of ways they weren't necessarily wrong to have done it. There was a definite disconnect in the language that Donald Trump had used at his rally the morning of that riot, and the language he had previously used on Twitter. So to his credit, at that rally, Donald Trump had said that he was going to lead them to the Capitol building to protest peacefully. You know, he was very explicit about that. But previously on Twitter, he had also told his followers that they needed to go out and quote-unquote show force. And so he tells them they need to show force, and then a lot of them show up armed to a rally that's eventually going to move over to the Capitol building. I don't honestly think that that was what Donald Trump had in mind when he said that. But the simple fact of the matter is that, you know, as the President of the United States, you know, and he is at this time still the president. I mean, he won't be as of the time that this podcast is finally seen. But at the time of that rally, he was still the president of the United States. He still had at his disposal literally millions of dollars in communications expertise. If he had utilized it, they might have actually told him that, you know, phrases such as show force are probably not the right thing to be saying in this kind of a situation, especially not when you're planning an in-person rally. I mean, his language was sloppy and it was reckless, and in this case it had some very disturbing consequences. And while I don't really think that Donald Trump directly incited that riot, I think that he does have a hand in it. And I think that it was a perfectly responsible thing for these social media companies to do to restrict his ability to continue doing those things, especially given that, you know, Donald Trump, he doesn't really listen to other people when they tell him that he shouldn't do this kind of stuff. You know, as a matter of fact, I think that if he had listened to more people, I think that he would still be the president today. I think that if he had actually never had Twitter, he might still be the president today. Now, removing Trump or restricting him was something that was well within the rights of these companies to do. But one thing that was really not within their rights to do was the next thing that happened, and the next thing that happened after that was that the social media service Parler was taken down. Now, for anybody who's not aware of it, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are a lot of people who aren't aware of it, Parler was effectively, it was an alternative to Twitter that was established after people were becoming unhappy with the amount of censorship that was going on that site. And so essentially they established themselves as the free speech social media platform. And they attracted a lot of visitors simply by saying that they were not going to censor their users. And apparently that wasn't enough for the big tech oligopoly, because one of the first things that started to happen immediately after that was that Google and Amazon and Apple all started to pull Parler down off of their services. So in the cases of Google and Apple, they took their app off of their app store. But Amazon actually went one step further than that. They withdrew their web hosting services from Parler, which basically wound up shutting down their website altogether. Now, did they actually have the right to do that? It actually looks like, according to their contract with Parler, it looks like they didn't. It looks like they were obligated to give Parler a 30-day notice of any kind of just a suspension, let alone a termination of services. So they didn't provide that, so Parler has already filed a lawsuit, and they've already sought a restraining order against Amazon, and according to the terms of the contract, it actually looks like Parler's odds are pretty good in that action. And so the justification that Google and Apple and Amazon all offered for their actions against Parler was they said that Parler's standards in terms of what they allow on the site and what they don't allow on the site just weren't up to snuff. And so all kinds of examples started to kind of come out about things that were said on Parler, and admittedly there were some pretty awful things being said about Parler. I think one thing that really stood out in my mind was I saw some excerpts of some messages that somebody had put up, and they had basically said that what they wanted to do was they wanted to kill all the Democratic lawmakers, and they wanted to kill their families in front of them. It was basically just a horrific revenge fantasy. Like the kind of revenge fantasy drummed up by somebody who doesn't really have any power in their life, and somebody who, in all honesty, based on the kinds of things that they fantasize about, and really any amount of power that they ever could have should probably be kept far, far away from them, because they would not use it well. But as it turns out, Parler had already been taking steps to control that kind of stuff. As a matter of fact, one of the things that they had already been doing is that they had already been using artificial intelligence algorithms that had been developed by Amazon themselves. I mean, they might be an anti-censorship social media platform, but there are limits to that, and for Parler, the limits to that was actual violent messaging. According to reports, it seems like Parler was actually quite effective at removing this kind of stuff. Arguably much more effective than Twitter has been. There are still some things that still exist on Twitter to this day, including things like, apparently there was at one point, there was a Kill Trump hashtag that a lot of tweets are still up from now. And so there should be little question that there's been a double standard at play. And whenever there's a double standard at play, you actually have to ask yourself what exactly the whole thing is about. About really whether or not the whole thing is actually about cracking down on violent messaging or not. And as it turns out in this case, there's a lot of questions. Now, once there's a double standard, you very much do have to ask yourself the question of what really this is all about. Once there's a double standard on something like this, you have to draw the conclusion that really this is not just about trying to contain violent messaging. Otherwise, they would be doing a much better job of applying that to themselves than they are of trying to apply it to their competitors. Now, if it's not about cracking down on violent rhetoric, then really what is it about? And really, in my opinion, what it comes down to this. In political science, there's a concept called the Overton window. Explained most simply, what the Overton window is basically it's what you would call the upper and lower limits of policy that people will tolerate. Now, if you take that a step further and elaborate on it a little bit, it becomes almost this range of ideas that you can have and things that you can say. And I think that a lot of these social media companies are actually looking to their terms of service and to their ability to censor people as an opportunity to enforce what they think the Overton window should be. And going out of their way to shut down their competitors so that the people that they're kicking off of their own platforms don't have another place to go to where there isn't such censorship, is, in my view, their way of controlling that Overton window not only across the entirety of the internet, but when you think about it, over the entirety of society itself. And when you look at the ways that they enforce it, it's clear that there's a double standard in terms of this Overton window. If you're a Republican or if you're a conservative, then you can't question the results of the 2020 election. But meanwhile, Democrats just spent 4 years claiming that the only reason why Trump had won the 2016 election was because he had effectively cheated, because he had colluded with Vladimir Putin and Russia in order to win that election away from Hillary Clinton, who they honestly still do believe was the rightful president of the United States. Now, all of the investigations that they had into the 2016 election found basically no evidence of that. And a lot of the things that they had used to try to justify having those investigations in the first place turned out to be, in some cases, propaganda that was generated by literal foreign spies. But for 4 years, they were allowed to go on and on and on about that sort of stuff without anything even resembling a fact check being attached to their social media posts. So it's pretty clear in this particular case there was two different standards. And actually what that kind of means that in this situation there was not just two different standards. What it really means is that there was two different Overton windows. There was one that they maintained for themselves, and there was one that they forced onto other people. I think that if you looked back over the past 4 years in particular, you would actually see that there really has been two different Overton windows. There are all sorts of things that are said about Republicans and about conservatives that, quite frankly, would never ever be tolerated if they were said by a Republican or a conservative about anybody else. On one side of it, you had people who went on for 4 years basically body-shaming Trump and calling him the fat, bad orange man. But actually, recently, a football coach at the University of Tennessee, Chattanooga, he actually just got fired for saying something very similar about Stacey Abrams. For those unaware, Stacey Abrams was formerly the Democratic nominee for the governorship of Georgia, and she lost that election fair and square and has been spending pretty much every day since then claiming that it was stolen from her. And Abrams herself had posted all sorts of tweets calling Donald Trump fat and ugly, and of course that was okay for her, but as soon as somebody does it to her, they're fired. You know, here's an example that's a little bit closer to home. Now, on a previous test podcast, I had talked about Ryan Jesperson being dismissed from 630 Ched in Edmonton, basically because he had uttered racial slurs on the radio. He went on the radio and he had called the staff of a city councilor, quote unquote, a bunch of chimpanzees. And then it turned out that this particular city councilor, he actually had people on his staff who were visible minorities. And so that was a very bad situation. That councilor came out and he demanded an apology. And actually at first he got an apology, but then Ryan Jesperson, he went into a text message with a listener. And in a private text message, he repeated the same thing again. He sent the guy a picture of a chimpanzee. And so his apology was obviously not sincere. I mean, an apology that's immediately followed by the same behavior that you were apologizing for is obviously not an apology that's very sincere. But a lot of Jesperson's listeners, his most avid fans, actually demanded that he be allowed to get away with it, mostly because they hated the city councilor that he was criticizing so much. And so the idea that his listeners had, and I think that in all honesty, based on his own behavior after the fact, he obviously had the same opinion, but the opinion was that because they didn't like the person that they were doing this to, that suddenly this was acceptable behavior. And of course, his employer decided that it was not acceptable behavior, and they wound up letting him go. You know, his listeners were so embittered about that fact that he wasn't allowed to just get away with that they spent months afterward demanding the head of Danielle Smith, who was kind of his counterpart morning radio host out of a station in Calgary. And of course, Danielle Smith, she hadn't done anything wrong, so she didn't get fired, although she did recently announce that she was leaving the radio. Probably at least in part due to the amount of pressure that's been put on her since Ryan Jesperson got fired. The whole idea was kind of just as simple as, they got one of ours, so we're going to try to get one of theirs. Despite the fact that the other person really hasn't done anything wrong. So in the minds of these people, their Overton window for Ryan Jesperson was actually pretty broad. Their Overton window was actually wide enough that it can contain such a thing as, you can utter racial slurs on the radio so long as it's at the expense of somebody that we don't like. But in the case of Danielle Smith, that Overton window was narrow enough that you can't even exist on the radio. In another example that's closer to home, and this one for me is literally very close to home, there's an NDP candidate in BC in this past round of provincial elections, actually the wife of somebody who I formerly had considered a friend, who actually had taunted me about the death of my mother this past year. Now, this person didn't win their election. As a matter of fact, they lost about 1,000 votes over the person who had previously run for the NDP in that riding. And as a matter of fact, that's actually a very common thing for this person. When this person runs for the NDP, she tends to lose actually about 1,000 votes over whoever had been the previous candidate. Obviously not the kind of person to expend a lot of mental energy on, because quite frankly, she's just not worth it. But I think that you could safely guarantee that if she had been in my shoes in that situation and somebody had come along and taunted her like that, it would have been a much bigger deal to her. And I think to most people that would have been unthinkable, but apparently it wasn't unthinkable for her to do the same thing to me. So when you break down each of these situations, what you have in each of them is really you have two different sets of standards. You have two different Overton windows. Now there's a reason for that. Now, when the Overton window was originally conceptualized, and the way that it's most traditionally applied, it kind of assumes that there's some degree of unity within a particular society, that everybody shares the same values and wants the same things. But I think that as we look at our politics now, we're seeing something very, very different from that.